The apartment on the second floor of an old brick house on the outskirts of Boston was quiet except for the creaking metronome and the soft, almost inaudible sounds of a violin. Betty James sat on a low stool, slouching over the instrument that knew more about her soul than anyone else. The violin was old, the lacquered surface tarnished, the case scratched, the strings changed as infrequently as the family budget allowed. The instrument had been the last gift from her father, a street musician who, despite his poverty, called music the only wealth that could be passed on. He played on the streets outside the Prudential Center until his fingers froze and his voice was torn by wind and time. That evening when he handed her the case with the yellowed inner linings, he said, "Play, Betty. Even if the world turns away, the violin is always listening." She hadn't realized it then, but now the words were almost a prayer. It had been a hard day. Betty had been scrubbing floors since 6 in the morning in the restaurant at the Langham Hotel, where she'd worked since she'd failed to get into the New England Conservatory of Music. Then at 17 she received a letter with the headline, "We admire your talent, but," and that was it. Then there were bills, canned bean dinners and part-time jobs until midnight. Her mother, a former librarian with a bad back, couldn't work, her younger brother was in technical college, and her father's pension, when he died, disappeared faster than they could figure out how to spend it. Every dollar Betty earned she brought home. Every spare minute she stole from fatigue to play. Waitressing at the Langham meant smiling through a toothache, holding a tray with 4 glasses of champagne with one hand, and listening to old ladies in furs complain about the rotten service class. In the evening, when the last guest had left and the cleaners had already begun mopping the floors, Betty would go to the dressing room. There, in the corner, on a hook, hung a case with a black violin, belonging to the orchestra that sometimes performed at the hotel. Why it stayed there no one knew. But Betty took it with reverence, as if the instrument knew it would serve no purpose. In the huge empty hall, under chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls, she would sit on the edge of the stage and play. Not loudly, in a whisper. As if afraid to awaken the wealth sleeping within these walls. Today was different. All the staff had been whispering since morning that Wesley Thorne was coming. Heir to the glass empire, a millionaire with the face of a movie star and a heart that was the stuff of legends. It was said he kept his chauffeur on a leash and once fired a waitress for dropping his fork. His parties were for show, for the press, for his partners, for himself. He liked to shatter people's confidence, to pull the ground out from under their feet, to watch them pale and smile at the same time. That evening the room was filled with people who smelled of expensive tobacco, French perfume, and boredom. Light jazz sounded, fluttering over tables of oysters and miniature tartlets. Betty slid between chairs, pouring champagne, counting tips in her mind, wishing it were over. She wasn't looking to meet him. But Thorne had noticed her. Sitting in the center of the room, surrounded by men in ties and women in gloves, he raised his hand sharply. And at that moment the whole hall fell silent, as if someone had turned off the sound in the huge room. His eyes, bright, ice-colored, stared into hers. He did not smile. Didn't look interested. It was the look of a hunter who had spotted game caught between the trees. He rose slowly, walked over, and said softly so only she could hear, "They say you play the violin. Show me." It wasn't a request. It was an order. And she knew it would cost her dearly to refuse. The room filled with voices again, but there was only one thing ringing above everything, the trembling in Betty's fingers that clutched the tray. She nodded, walked toward the stage. And with each step the feeling grew stronger. Tonight she was placed not in the spotlight, but on the edge of a cliff. When Betty stepped on the stage, the world around her sounded different, as if someone had turned a record over and the needle had slid on a new track. The overly bright lights were in her face, obscuring the expressions of the audience, but she could feel their presence, the rustle of furs, the light laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the scent of cinnamon tangerines wafting into the air as a companion to December receptions. She could hear the rustle of silk, the squeak of patent shoes, short laughs tinged with boredom, and it all came with a growing hum, like a flock of crows over a snow-covered field. The violin was handed to her by a man in the orchestra. She recognized him, the gray-haired violinist who was always the first to leave rehearsals. He didn't say a word, only held her gaze a fraction of a second longer than necessary. His fingers squeezed the fingerboard, then released it. The instrument was as cold as metal. Not at all like her home violin, warm from time, from fingers, from memory. This one was foreign, sterile, neutral, like the stage itself. Betty sat on the edge of the chair as she had been taught as a child, knees drawn together, chin to the clipboard. The woozy jazz band music still played in the hall, but as she brought her bow to the strings, the melody faded. All that was left was silence. People were still drinking and chatting, but there was a wariness in their gazes. They were curious, which meant it was dangerous. My fingers trembled. The bow slipped slightly off the first string, making a muffled sound like a sigh. A few people giggled. Someone whispered. Suddenly it popped into her head. Something she hadn't remembered in years. She hadn't been born yet, but she'd heard that sound. Not with her ears, but with her skin, her blood, her bone resonance. The Arlington Street underpass, the smell of wet cardboard and warm chestnuts, her father in a shabby coat playing for passers-by, and her mother sitting nearby with her hand on her stomach. She stared at him without blinking, as if afraid of losing the melody. And every time Dad slowed down, Mom would clench her fist and then let go. And Betty, not yet born, would freeze inside her. It all made sense now. This music she didn't just know, it was part of her. The bow slid across the strings 1, 2, 3. And suddenly the sound came to life. It wasn't precise, it wasn't perfect, but it was alive. There was something broken but sincere about it. Like the voice of a person crying in the dark. She played the first phrase. Then the second. Her hands began to obey. The bow stopped trembling. The strings responded. The music sounded soft, almost audible, but people stopped talking. Conversations were cut off. The crunch of ice in glasses no longer overrode the music. Even the waiters stopped. Someone turned their head. Someone raised their eyebrows. A woman in a burgundy dress slowly lowered her fork. A neighbor dropped a cigarette on the floor without noticing. Wesley Thorne stood, leaning back slightly in his chair, with the same expression of haughty boredom. But as the sounds of the violin wrapped the guests in thin invisible ribbons, his gaze changed. First he squinted. Then he pressed his lips together. At one point, his hand holding the glass trembled slightly. He set it down on the table without taking his eyes off the scene. His face was no longer smiling. His face was empty, like frozen water before a storm. And Betty continued to play. And she felt the fear recede. In its place was a warmth that ran up her spine, filled her chest, flooded her neck. She could no longer hear the hall. Didn't see the faces. There was only the violin. And the memory. And suddenly, in a nearby row, she noticed a woman. She was sitting a little to the side, wearing a light gray hat with a veil covering part of her face. She wasn't applauding. She wasn't drinking. Wasn't whispering with her neighbors. Just staring. Straight on. Quietly. The way her mother had once looked at her father in the crosswalk. With the same pain. The same hope. The bow drew a final line across the string. The sound froze like the breath before a scream. There was silence. Not theatrical. Real. Everything that couldn't be said in words rang in it. And only then, when the silence became unbearable, did the first claps sound. The first claps. Solitary. But they were the loudest. By the time the last claps had died down and the orchestra was playing something toothless and phoneless, Betty had disappeared backstage. She didn't look back, didn't listen to the guest discussions, didn't catch any stares. She just walked, trying not to stumble, though her knees trembled like after a fever. She still clutched the violin in her hands too tightly, as if she might lose it if she let go even for a second. Her body felt strangely light, almost numb as it does after a long exertion. It was unreal. Absurd. Like a dream in which you suddenly find yourself at the center of the stage and then wake up from your own insecurity. Only now Betty wasn't asleep. She heard someone drop a glass in the audience. How a knee was slapped. How her name had been shouted. But it all remained on the other side of the barrier, on the other side of the curtain behind which she was nothing again. Or almost nothing. She sat down on a wooden crate against the wall, dropped her head on her hands, still holding the violin. Her palms were damp. Her throat was scratchy. Just as the tension began to recede, she heard footsteps. Slow, soft but sure. Heeled shoes that didn't clatter but almost whispered across the floor. Betty looked up. Standing before her was a woman in a light fur-trimmed coat and a gray hat she recognized at once. The same one. From the auditorium. From the front row. With a veil covering half her face. The woman took off her gloves, folded them in half as if she were in her own home. Then slowly sat down on the same crate nearby. You don't just play well. You play like you remember something the others have forgotten, she said without looking at Betty. There was no admiration or arrogance in her voice. Only weariness. And something akin to cautious warmth. Betty nodded, unable to find the words. The woman held out her hand. Evelyn Thorne, she said softly. The name hung in the air like a long shadow. Betty felt something inside her clench. Wesley's mother. The same woman about whom the maids had whispered. She had once been a beauty, but had grown taciturn with age. Indeed, there was something frozen in her face as in ancient portraits, without time, without emotion, but with history. Evelyn bowed her head. I would like to see you tomorrow. At our house. If you don't mind, of course. The next day Betty stood at the heavy wrought iron gates leading to the Thorne mansion in the Beacon Hill neighborhood. The rain was drizzling, the wind was tearing the buttons of her coat, and everything around her looked like painted charcoal. She doubted it to the last, but there was something in Evelyn's voice yesterday that wouldn't let go. There were no promises. Only anticipation. The servant opened the door almost immediately as if he knew she was coming. The Thornes' house was not luxurious, it was museum-like. Ceilings too high, staircases too narrow, furniture that looked more expensive than Betty's annual salary. A fireplace burned in one of the rooms, smelling of lavender and ashes. Evelyn sat in a chair by the window, poring over some papers. At the sight of Betty, she only nodded a brief, almost businesslike gesture. I want to tell you a story, she said, pointing to the chair opposite. Years ago I fell in love with a musician. He played in the streets by the park. It was reckless, ridiculous. I was told I was crazy. And maybe I was. Betty was out of breath. The words sounded like an echo. He left without knowing I was pregnant. I didn't want to restrain him. I didn't want his talent to fade in the shadow of responsibilities. Evelyn lowered her eyes. I married Thorne Sr. We had a son. You saw him yesterday. The pause hovered. She felt metal in it, sharp, cold. That musician's name was Jackson James, Evelyn said, barely moving her lips. The name sounded like a slap. Betty froze. It was her father's name. The street fiddler from Arlington Street. The one who had played until his voice broke. The one who died of a cold because he didn't want to go to the orphanage. Nobody said anything. Just sat there. The fire creaked in the room. Outside the window the rain sounded. And as if somewhere in the distance, music sounded, barely audible, barely discernible. A memory. Or a premonition. The days that followed were blurred, as if someone had put a layer of translucent paper over reality. Betty lived in a gap between questions she dreaded to hear answered and answers she couldn't think of. Working at the hotel became a formality. Fetch, clean, nod, disappear. Wesley Thorne hadn't uttered a word in her direction since that evening. Hadn't looked. Hadn't approached her. It was as if her performance hadn't happened at all. Or the other way around, it had happened too much to recognize its existence. But Evelyn appeared more and more often. Not as the host's mother. Not as a woman with a Wall Street-sounding last name. But as someone who knew what it was like to sit on the edge of your own destiny, afraid to look down. She'd invited Betty into the house as if she'd always been there, just been away for a long time. No questions asked. No fuss. She showed her rooms, silently led her down corridors with wiped carpets and oval-framed portraits. These walls had once heard music, she'd said once, and her gaze was not on Betty, but somewhere through her, somewhere where someone might still be playing. On one such evening, when the house smelled only of wax and old pages, Evelyn brought out a case. It was lined with velvet, with worn brass clasps and an M engraved on the lid. The violin inside, the same one Betty had played at the reception, turned out to be more than just a piece of orchestral property. It was my mother's, Evelyn said, and something personal trembled in her voice for the first time. Her name was Margaret. She played for herself. For the family. And then when the war started, she just stopped. Betty ran her fingers over the fingerboard. The instrument seemed alive, as if it knew whose hands it was in. Everything that was happening seemed implausible to Betty. She tried to push the speculation away. Write it all off to coincidences, to oddities, to dreams that crawl into the day and break logic. But then something happened that set everything straight. Almost. She was sitting in the mansion's music room, leafing through old albums. Evelyn had gone to make tea, leaving Betty alone with the past. The photos were yellowed, the edges torn, the paper brittle. One showed a girl in a flower-patterned summer dress, against the backdrop of the very garden that was now overgrown and silent. Betty stopped. The girl in the photo was herself. Or almost herself. The slit of her eyes. The ovals of the cheekbones. Even the mole above her upper lip. On the back it says, Maggie. August 1939. Maggie was short for Margaret. Betty leaned back in her chair as if the photo had pushed her back. Everything merged into a tangle: the music, the violin, the look on the woman's face in the hat, her father's name, Wesley's silence. She felt like she didn't understand the most important thing. But the understanding was there. Under her skin. In her throat. In the evening, just as she was about to leave, Wesley came over. He emerged from the darkness of the hallway like a man accustomed not to ask, but to make her listen. He didn't look her in the eye. Just nodded. Library. Now. She followed him. Silence stretched between them like a cold ribbon. The library smelled of leather, dust, and something spicy. Wesley stood at the window, hands in his pockets, gaze outward as if something important was happening there. His voice was detached, almost lazy. You look like her. Not like your mother. Like the one before her. Betty didn't answer. She didn't know who he was talking about. Or knew and was afraid to admit it. The pause dragged on. Then he turned. His face was alien, chiseled from the same stone as the walls of the mansion. Tell me, did your father ever play at the old church on the corner of Becker Street? The question was asked almost carelessly. But there was a tinkle in it. Like the last note in a play, after which there is silence. Betty didn't know what to say. Yes, her father had played there. It was where passers-by left coins in the case where she had first held the violin. But how did he know? Wesley didn't wait for an answer. He turned away as if the conversation was over. Betty stood in the shadow of the bookshelves, feeling something ancient creaking inside her, as if someone else's story was coming through the cracks in her life. Only all of it, it turned out, had long been her own. She just hadn't known it. Until now. The Thorns house breathed silence, like an empty church after a service. The sun shone through the heavy curtains and dust particles hung in the air like musical notes without rhythm. Evelyn didn't say a word this day. She simply gestured Betty into the second-floor study, a room where no one but the landlady ever went. The door creaked open like a movie about an old time. It was cool inside and smelled of lavender, slightly crumbled paper, and that odor of long-closed chests. There was a dresser in the corner, and behind the glass were books, clippings, photos, awards, records. But Betty's attention was immediately attracted by a box extended to the middle of the table. Rectangular, upholstered in faded velvet with a small lock, long since broken. She didn't ask permission. Just sat down and opened it. Inside were letters. A stack tied with blue ribbon. Yellowed envelopes, some with addresses, some with initials only. The paper is brittle like autumn leaves, the handwriting is florid, uneven. All the letters were addressed to the same woman -M. Sometimes Maggie, sometimes just you. Betty read slowly. The letters were like confessions. In them was the voice of a man, loving and ashamed of his poverty. He asked her to wait. He wrote that he would soon find work in another city, that he would return. He didn't know she was expecting a child. In the last letter, just a few lines and then, separately, a neatly enclosed sheet of sheet music. A score. Simple, 4-line with notes, apparently handwritten. A melody. The same one. The one Betty had played in the hall in front of rich and empty eyes. The one she'd heard inside her since she was a child. The one that seemed to live in her blood. She stared at that sheet as proof of something that felt at her fingertips all the time, but had no name. There was no signature on the letter. Only the date, October, 1949. Evelyn stood at the window, her back to her. Didn't turn. Didn't interfere. But when Betty looked at her, Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. It was clear without words, this letter was from her father. Jack James. The musician from the street. The same one who had become a myth in their house. Only now the myth was fleshed out. Betty took the letter and the score. Evelyn said nothing. Just nodded, approvingly, gently, like a mother who no longer held a weight. Betty came home late. The apartment seemed narrower than usual. The kitchen smelled as always of boiled corn and tiredness. Her mother was sitting in her bathrobe reading the newspaper. When Betty entered, she looked up and realized at once that her daughter had not just come in from the street. The words came hard. Betty told everything, not as an interrogation, not as a confession, but as a story about someone else's life, in which she suddenly found herself entwined. Her mother was silent. Then a quiet sob. She took the score, looked at it, pressed it to her chest, and tears rolled down her cheeks. She cried silently, like a person who hasn't allowed herself weakness in a long time. It had all turned out to be true. Betty was not her own. But she was loved. And that explained everything. Her mother had said only one thing: I couldn't let you go to that house. Not then. But now everything had changed. The next evening someone knocked on the door. Betty opened it. On the doorstep stood Wesley. No security. No car on the sidewalk. In a plain coat. His face was calm, as if he were walking not on asphalt but on water, unafraid of falling through. He didn't say hello or why he'd come. He just held out a sheet. The score. The same one. Play it, he said. Quietly. No orders. No playing. Just a request. Betty took out her violin. Sat down by the window. The bow rested on the strings. The notes sounded like coming home. Slowly. Cling. No pathos. Wesley sat across from him, unblinking, unbreathing. Listen. Only when the melody faded did he look up. "You're my sister," he said without changing his expression. And Betty realized, there was no more enmity between them, no difference in surname, no past to hide. There was only music. And the truth. And you can't shout it. Even in the noisiest hall. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.